It was a quiet evening when Sarah first discovered the text message. It was simple, almost innocent, just a name and a time. But to Sarah, it felt like a punch to the gut. "Meet me at 9 p.m. I have something important to tell you." Her heart raced as she stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of her eyes. She had no idea what was coming, but she could already feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The message was from Mark, her husband of 5 years, the man she thought she knew better than anyone. But something had shifted in their marriage recently. The laughter and conversations that once filled their home had turned into uncomfortable silences. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew something wasn't right. She had caught him on the phone late at night a few times, talking in hushed tones, and even though he always dismissed it, a sinking feeling had lodged itself in her chest. She'd tried to push it away, tell herself she was just being paranoid, but now, with this message, it felt like all of her doubts were about to come crashing down. With trembling hands, Sarah glanced at the clock. It was already 8:30 p.m. Should she go? Should she confront him? Every instinct screamed at her to ignore the message, to leave things as they were, to pretend like everything was fine. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. As Sarah made her way to the cafe where Mark had asked her to meet him, her mind raced. What could he possibly want to tell her? Why now, after everything seemed so perfect on the surface? She remembered the last few months, the strained looks, the distant conversations. Had she missed something? Had she been blind to the truth all along? Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with anxiety. When she arrived at the cafe, the place was almost empty. A couple of late-night workers sat in the corner, and the dim lighting created an almost eerie atmosphere. Sarah spotted Mark right away. He was sitting at their usual table, looking out the window, but as soon as he saw her, he turned to face her. There was something different about him, a strange tension in the way he looked at her, like he was waiting for something. Maybe he was waiting for her to speak first, or maybe he didn't know how to start the conversation. "Mark?" Sarah's voice barely broke the silence, but he immediately stood up, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to do this, but I have to be honest with you," he said quietly, looking at the ground. What was going on? What was he about to confess? Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had asked herself a million times what could be wrong, but this was the moment she'd been dreading. The seconds dragged on and Sarah braced herself, her heart pounding. But then, before he could say anything more, his phone buzzed. Mark's face went pale. He hesitated before picking it up, glancing at the screen with wide eyes. His expression shifted, from confusion to fear, and just as quickly he turned away from her. "I have to go. We'll talk later." Confused, Sarah reached out, but he was already walking out the door. What had just happened? What was he hiding? And what had that message really meant? Sarah stood frozen in place, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. Mark had looked at her with a kind of urgency she didn't recognize, and then he'd left without even a proper explanation. The weight of the silence in the cafe seemed to suffocate her, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against her chest. She stared at the empty chair across from her, trying to make sense of the last few minutes. Nothing about this felt right. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her best friend Lily. How did it go? Lily had been there for Sarah through everything, from the good to the bad, and had always been her sounding board. Sarah quickly typed a response telling her what had just happened, leaving out the parts about Mark's sudden fear and departure. She didn't want to worry Lily yet. But as she stared at the screen, Sarah felt a pang of frustration. She couldn't just ignore this. Mark had been acting strange for months now. Little things at first, missed calls, the way he'd been protective of his phone, the way he'd stay late at work and avoid her questions. He used to be so open with her. It felt like she was losing him, like something was slipping through her fingers, but she couldn't figure out what. And tonight, that message? "I have something important to tell you." It didn't make sense. Sarah had always been the type to second-guess herself, to overthink every word and every gesture, but something about this felt different. She wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong. She left the cafe soon after Mark disappeared, feeling more confused than ever. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear the fog in her mind. She glanced at her phone again, thinking about calling him, but a part of her hesitated. What if he didn't want to talk? What if he was avoiding her for a reason she didn't understand? As she got into her car, Sarah thought about the night they met. Mark had been so open, so full of laughter and warmth. They'd spent hours talking, sharing stories and dreams, and everything about him had felt genuine. He was the one who had always listened, who had been there through every high and low. What had changed? The drive home felt longer than it should have, each streetlight passing like a reminder that things weren't the same anymore. When she pulled into the driveway, the house felt cold and distant, like it belonged to someone else. She stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Then her phone buzzed again, and this time it was Mark. She quickly opened the message. "I'm sorry. I need to tell you something, but not over text. Please, just trust me." The message felt like a dagger. The same words, the same sense of urgency, but now a deeper level of secrecy. Sarah bit her lip, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What could he possibly need to confess? Had he been hiding something from her all along? Was it something to do with their marriage, or was it something more? Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. It was a number she didn't recognize. Hesitating, Sarah answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause, followed by a quiet, almost inaudible voice. "Sarah, it's me. You need to be careful." The line went dead. Her heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Who was that? And why did it feel like everything was spiraling out of control? Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the phone, the silence on the other end pressing against her like a heavy weight. Who was that? The voice had sounded familiar but distorted, like it had been muffled through a tunnel. She tried to call back, but the number was already disconnected. Her pulse quickened as the uncertainty clawed at her. Why did the voice seem so urgent, and why was it telling her to be careful? She needed answers. Sarah stood in her living room, pacing back and forth, the coolness of the house amplifying the knot tightening in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong, and she was on the edge of discovering it. She had trusted Mark with everything, and now this, the messages, the odd behavior, and now this cryptic phone call. The dots weren't connecting, and she hated feeling this way, like she was being kept in the dark. Her mind kept circling back to what Mark had said when he left the cafe. "I have something important to tell you." What could it possibly be? Was it about their relationship? Or was there something far more sinister at play? She had to know. Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone again, debating whether to reach out to him. But she knew deep down Mark wasn't going to answer her call. Not now. Instead, she decided to take matters into her own hands. If Mark wasn't going to talk to her, maybe someone else would. Her thoughts immediately turned to his work. Mark had recently started a new project at the office, something he had been unusually secretive about. He had always been an open book, sharing details of his day, his clients, his struggles, but for the past few weeks, he'd been different. He'd come home later than usual, often distracted, and when she asked about his work, he'd brush her off, claiming it was nothing important. But was it really just work? Or was there something, or someone, else? Without another thought, Sarah grabbed her coat and left the house, her steps quick and purposeful. The drive to Mark's office felt like it took an eternity, her mind racing with possibilities. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but she needed to understand what was going on. Maybe she could talk to one of his colleagues, maybe someone who had seen or heard something unusual. As she parked her car near the office building, the chill of the night air seeped into her bones. She hesitated for a moment, glancing up at the building. The lights in the windows were dim, but she could see movement inside. The office wasn't completely empty. Sarah stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement, and made her way inside. The security guard at the front desk gave her a polite nod as she walked in, but Sarah could tell he didn't recognize her. She smiled awkwardly and quickly walked past him, trying to keep her calm. She didn't have much time. She needed to find someone, anyone, who could give her a hint of what Mark was hiding. When she reached the elevator, she almost pressed the button for the top floor, where Mark's office was, but something stopped her. A voice echoed from around the corner, a familiar voice. It was Mark's voice, but it wasn't coming from the elevator or from the hallway outside his office. It was coming from the break room, which was tucked away at the back of the floor. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she was about to walk into, but her curiosity got the better of her. She quietly moved toward the break room, her footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. As she approached the door, she caught snippets of Mark's conversation. He was talking to someone, but the words were too muffled for her to make out. Sarah leaned closer, trying to catch more of the conversation. Then, just as she was about to push open the door, she heard a voice she didn't recognize. A woman's voice. "You need to fix this, Mark. She's starting to get suspicious." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman's voice was sharp, filled with urgency. She felt her stomach drop. What was going on? Who was this woman? And what did she mean by, "she's starting to get suspicious"? Mark's response was barely audible, but it carried a weight of guilt. "I know. I didn't plan for it to go this far, but we can't back out now." Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as though the ground had slipped out from under her, and everything she thought she knew about her marriage was suddenly in question. What was Mark involved in? And why had he been so determined to keep her in the dark? Before she could process what she'd just overheard, the door to the break room opened, and Mark stepped out. His eyes widened when he saw her standing there, shock flooding his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It felt like the world had stopped moving. But Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She needed to know. "Who was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. Mark's expression faltered, and he took a step back, as if preparing to run. "Sarah, you don't understand," he began. But she could already feel the tension rising between them, like an invisible barrier that had suddenly appeared. And she knew that the truth, whatever it was about to shatter everything. Mark's eyes flickered nervously, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the right words. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her body feeling as though it were frozen in place. She had to know what was going on. Why had he been so secretive? Why had he acted so distant? And now, this conversation, with a woman she didn't recognize. Her mind raced with 1,000 different scenarios, none of them good. "Mark, who was that woman? What is happening? Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" she asked, her voice trembling but laced with an urgency she couldn't hide. She stepped closer, unable to stand still any longer. She wanted answers. She needed them. Mark backed away slightly, his gaze shifting toward the break room door, as if he could somehow retreat back into that space. "Sarah, it's complicated. I never wanted you to get involved in this." His voice was strained, his face pale. He looked like a man on the edge, caught between the past he'd tried to leave behind and the truth that was starting to unravel in front of them. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to just let it go, but her emotions were in overdrive. "Complicated? Mark, you've been lying to me for weeks. You've been hiding things, acting strange, and now this? You're not just hiding something, Mark. You're hiding someone." He winced as though her words had struck him harder than anything she could have said. He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing shallow. "It's not like that, Sarah. I swear. It's about business, about people I've been working with, and things got out of hand." Sarah's eyes narrowed, disbelief creeping into her voice. "Business? What kind of business? You expect me to believe that? Mark, this isn't just about work anymore. It's about us. It's about everything." Her mind spun with questions. Why hadn't he been honest? Was he involved in something dangerous? Or worse, was he being blackmailed? Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He seemed to hesitate, like he was weighing something inside of him. The silence between them stretched painfully, thick with tension. Sarah took a step closer, her hands trembling, but she didn't care. She needed the truth now. I'm not asking for your excuses, Mark. I need to know what's going on, Sarah demanded, her voice firm despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. His eyes darted to the break room door again, his face pale. I can't tell you here, Sarah. It's too dangerous. I'm not sure who's listening. Sarah froze. Dangerous? Her heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words sank in. Was this more than just a messy situation? Was there something darker at play? She didn't know if she could trust him anymore, but one thing was certain. She couldn't walk away without knowing the full truth. Without saying another word, Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him towards the elevator. We're going to talk about this. Now. No more running away. Mark's face flushed with panic, his pulse visibly racing as she pushed him forward. Sarah, please, you don't understand. I never meant for any of this to happen. But you can't just walk into this blind. There are people who don't want us to. Before he could finish, a voice interrupted them from behind. A cold, unfamiliar voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. I think it's time for both of you to stop. Sarah turned sharply to find a tall figure standing at the end of the hallway, a man she had never seen before, but there was something about him that made her stomach drop. He wore a black suit, the sleeves slightly rolled up to reveal tattoos on his forearms. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, scanning them both with an unsettling focus. Mark went still beside her, and Sarah could see the change in his demeanor immediately. He wasn't afraid, but the tension in his body told her everything. This man wasn't just someone he knew. He was someone Mark feared. What do you want? Mark asked, his voice strained. The man stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the floor with each step. He didn't say anything at first, just watched them with an almost calculating gaze. Sarah felt an icy chill settle in her bones, a sense of dread growing heavier with each passing second. This wasn't just about Mark's secrets anymore. It was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous. You're both getting involved in things you don't understand, the man said, his voice low but cold, like he was delivering a warning. And now, you've crossed a line. It's too late to back out, Mark. You know that. Sarah's heart raced. What was he talking about? What line had they crossed? Mark's silence spoke volumes, and the knot in her stomach tightened. This man wasn't just a colleague. He was a threat, a part of something much bigger than either of them. Who are you? Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes locked on Sarah. You really want to know? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. The air around them felt charged, like a storm was about to break. The words hung in the air, unanswered, as Sarah's mind raced. She was no longer sure who she could trust. Mark, this mysterious man, and the secrets he was hiding. Everything had just become much more complicated. And Sarah knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The man's words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah's mind spun, trying to grasp what was happening, but the answers she needed seemed just out of reach. Her eyes locked on Mark, who stood frozen beside her, his face ashen. This was the first time she had ever seen him like this, completely at a loss for words, utterly vulnerable. She'd always thought she knew him, but now it felt like he was a stranger standing next to her, caught in something much darker than she could understand. Before she could demand more answers, the stranger's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, an emotion so fleeting Sarah couldn't place it. Fear, maybe? Or surprise? He quickly put the phone away and turned his attention back to them, his posture stiffening. You think you know what this is about, but you don't, he said, his tone colder than before. There are forces at play here far beyond what you can handle, and you're about to find that out the hard way. Suddenly, Mark's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah's arm. His grip was firm, almost desperate, and his voice dropped to a whisper. You need to leave, Sarah, now. Get out of here. It's not safe. Sarah's chest tightened. What was he talking about? Her instincts screamed at her to run, but something deeper, something stronger kept her rooted to the spot. Mark had never been like this before, agitated, afraid. It was as though the man in front of them wasn't just a threat to them. He was a threat to everything Mark had worked for. But before she could react, another voice, sharp and authoritative, echoed from behind her. "He's right, you know. It's already too late for both of you." The air seemed to shift in an instant. Sarah turned to see a second figure emerging from the shadows, a woman this time. She was tall, with dark hair and a commanding presence that sent an immediate chill down Sarah's spine. Unlike the man, this woman's expression was unreadable, almost robotic in its calmness. She had the look of someone who had seen far too much and was prepared for whatever came next. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied Sarah for a moment, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "You're asking the wrong question," she replied, her voice laced with condescension. "The real question is why you're still here. Why haven't you left yet? Haven't you figured it out?" The tension in the room escalated. Mark's grip on Sarah's arm tightened further. He pulled her back, trying to shield her from the stranger's cold gaze. "I told you to leave, Sarah. I wasn't kidding." His words were urgent, almost pleading. But it was too late. The woman's next words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're both in way over your heads. This isn't just about a little secret anymore. This is about control, power, and you're standing in the middle of something you won't be able to get out of." Mark's eyes flickered with fear, his usual confident demeanor slipping away. "No, I didn't want this for her. I didn't want her involved." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the panic that was slowly creeping into his tone. "But now she's here, and I can't protect her anymore." A deep silence followed, hanging heavy in the air. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. She didn't understand. What was happening? Mark had been hiding things from her, yes, but now this was something else entirely. These people, whoever they were, seemed to know more than she did, and she had a sinking feeling that she was caught in a game much bigger than she ever imagined. The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with cold certainty. "You're asking questions that no one can answer, not unless they're ready to make a choice that will change everything." "What choice?" Sarah blurted out, the words tumbling from her mouth before she could stop them. "What are you talking about?" The woman's smile deepened, almost as if she found Sarah's confusion amusing. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, her voice now dangerously calm. "But I can promise you this. It's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be painless." Mark looked at Sarah then, his eyes pleading. "You don't understand. You don't know what they'll do." Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed through the building, startling both of them. It sounded like something had fallen in the distance, but the noise was so abrupt and violent that Sarah felt her stomach drop. The woman didn't flinch. "It's starting," she said softly, almost too calmly. "The clock's ticking." At that moment, everything changed. The feeling in the air shifted again, as though the calm facade had cracked open to reveal something far more terrifying. Mark's face was now pale, and Sarah could see that the battle inside him had reached its peak. He knew something was coming, something he couldn't stop. And Sarah. Sarah wasn't sure what to do next. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't run. Not anymore. But whatever was about to unfold, she knew would push them both to the edge, and they were running out of time. Dot. The sudden crash reverberated through the building, rattling the walls and snapping Sarah back to reality. Her heart pounded as she looked around, feeling the air grow heavy with anticipation. Mark's face was pale, his hand still gripping her arm, but his eyes had hardened with something darker, something she hadn't seen before. "You need to listen to me, Sarah," he said, his voice now trembling. "It's too late. They're coming for you, for both of us. You can't stay here." The urgency in his words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Who's coming? What do you mean?" She couldn't make sense of any of this. Everything had spiraled out of control so fast. Mark wasn't the man she thought he was, and now it seemed the strangers were somehow involved in a story much bigger than either of them. The woman, standing cold and calm as ever, glanced at her watch and then at the door. "It's not a matter of choice anymore. The moment you walked in here, you sealed your fate." Her voice was like ice, calculated and emotionless. "And now it's time to pay the price." Suddenly, a low hum filled the room, growing louder by the second. Mark's eyes widened in fear. "We're out of time," he whispered. He turned to Sarah, his gaze frantic now. "Listen to me. Leave. Now. There's no saving us, but maybe you can still get out of here." Before she could respond, the doors to the room slammed open with force, and in walked two figures, shrouded in dark suits and sunglasses. They didn't speak a word, just stood there, their presence commanding, ominous. The woman nodded at them, a subtle acknowledgement that made Sarah's blood run cold. "They're the ones who clean up the mess. You won't see them coming, and you certainly won't get away. It's too late." Sarah's mind raced, the puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. This wasn't just about some dangerous secret or the strange man in the shadows. This was about something much larger, something they'd all been caught in. "Why?" Sarah's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "Why all of this? What is going on?" The woman's smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. "Because you chose to dig. You chose to get involved." She took a step forward, her eyes gleaming. "But you weren't supposed to. People like Mark—" She paused, her gaze moving to him, and Sarah saw something flicker in the woman's eyes. Was it pity? They're part of something bigger. They don't get to choose their way out, and neither do you. Mark's shoulders slumped, as though a weight had just been lifted. "I tried to warn you," he muttered, almost to himself, "but you wouldn't listen." It was then that Sarah understood. The entire time, Mark had been trying to protect her from this, from them. The men in suits weren't just cleaners, they were enforcers. And whatever this was, it was a dangerous game, one that had pulled them all in. And just as everything seemed to reach its breaking point, the unexpected happened. The woman's phone buzzed again, and this time, when she looked down at the screen, her face tightened. Her cool demeanor slipped, and for a split second, Sarah saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps? Or anger? She quickly composed herself, putting the phone away with haste. "This changes everything," she said, her voice colder now than ever before. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, changes?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the door and motioned for the suited men to follow. But just as they reached the threshold, the silence shattered with a deafening crack, like glass breaking under immense pressure. Mark's face drained of color. "No," he whispered under his breath, stepping back, horrified. "No, no, no!" Sarah's eyes darted from Mark to the door and then to the woman, whose face was now twisted with a mix of rage and disbelief. Before anyone could react, a figure, tall, almost spectral, emerged from the shadows behind her, standing in the doorway. It was the same man who had first warned them, the one who had started this whole mess. But now he wasn't just a messenger. He was the leader of this entire operation. And the real twist? He wasn't just working for the people in dark suits. He was the mastermind. "You thought you could outrun this," he said, his voice smooth, almost apologetic. "But you can't, Sarah. And Mark—" He glanced at him, shaking his head slightly. "You should have known better than to let her get involved." Everything froze. The tension was palpable, suffocating. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "I tried. I thought you'd be safe." But the man didn't care. His gaze shifted back to Sarah, his eyes full of cold calculation. And then, in one swift movement, he took a step forward, extending his hand to her. "Come with me, Sarah. It's not too late for you." The room held its breath, and for the first time Sarah didn't know who to trust. Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, as the figure before her extended his hand. For a moment the world felt like it was closing in. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Mark's face was filled with regret, but his eyes pleaded with her to make a decision. There was no turning back now. "Why?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. her mind racing. Why did you bring me into this? What's really going on here? The man in front of her didn't immediately answer. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of detached pity, as though he were explaining something to a child who hadn't yet understood the stakes. It was never about you, Sarah. It was about the information you stumbled upon. The moment you started digging, you became a part of something much bigger than you realized. You could have walked away, but you didn't. And now, you have a choice. Her gaze flicked to Mark, whose posture had slumped, defeated. He had tried, really tried, to protect her from this nightmare. But now it was clear. There was no way out. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The man's offer was tempting, promising safety, but at what cost? Could she trust him, after everything? "What's going to happen to Mark?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. The man gave Mark a glance, one that held no mercy. "He's a liability now. He didn't follow the rules." The finality in his words left no room for argument. Mark, the man who had tried to protect her, was now expendable in this dangerous game. Sarah's mind raced. She could see it now. The danger, the lies. She could take the man's hand and disappear into the shadows, live a life away from this mess. Or she could stay, stand her ground, and take a chance on exposing the truth. Without realizing it, her hand slowly moved towards the man's. But just as their fingers were about to meet, the unexpected happened. The woman who had been standing silently by the door lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's wrist. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "You don't understand. You never will. You have no idea what you're about to step into." Her grip was tight, almost painful, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled her arm away with a force she didn't know she had. "No, I know enough." And with that, everything shifted. The man's eyes hardened, his offer now a threat. But before he could react, a noise from the other side of the building interrupted the tense standoff. The door burst open, and a group of armed men flooded into the room. It was the chaos Sarah had been dreading, but this time, she wasn't going to be caught off guard. She turned toward the exit, not looking back. Mark was already on his feet, his face filled with determination. "Go!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Get out of here while you still can." Without thinking, Sarah ran. She didn't stop to question the noise or the danger. She didn't stop to ask what the next step would be. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that room another second. She didn't know what had happened to Mark, or what the man in the suit would do next. But for the first time, she had control. The weight of the decision still loomed, but Sarah had taken the first step toward her freedom. And as she made her way out of the building, her heart pounding in her chest, she realized that sometimes the hardest part was choosing to leave everything behind. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, but Sarah wasn't looking back. She didn't know what the future would hold or if the darkness would ever fully fade. But one thing was clear: she had broken free, and for now, that was enough.